looks like we have quite a good number of attendees. So I'm going to invite those of us on the panel who are not speaking now to just mute our mics. Yes, I will invite Juliana to open our event.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Juliana Barton, and I am the director of the Center for the Arts at Northeastern University. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I say this morning on the East Coast of the United States, but I know we have participants and attendees joining from around the world. So thank you all for tuning in whatever time zone you're in for this conversation, Imagining Infinitude, Artists and Curators in Conversation. We're really thrilled to have you with us for what I expect to be some incredible conversations. As the program's title suggests, we're joined today by artists and curators behind the exhibition Infinitude, which is currently on view at Northeastern's Gallery 360. First, co-curator Amy Halliday will introduce the exhibition with a virtual tour, and then we'll have two panels, each with a combination of artists and curators. We'll conclude with a Q&A session where you, the audience members, can put questions in, and there's information about that going out in the chat. One final note is that if you haven't actually had a chance to visit Infinitude yet, you're in luck, because we've just decided to extend the exhibition's run through April 16th, 2022. You can find more information about that on our website, both where the gallery is located, our hours, etc. And that information is also being put in the chat. So that's all I have for you. Going to keep it brief so we can make sure to prioritize all the conversations. So without further ado, I will hand it over to consulting curator Amy Halliday.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Juliana. And welcome everybody from all your different spaces and time zones. It's really delightful to have you here. And I really just want to thank the artists who are also tuning in, with, including Chitra, all the way from India, where I think it's about 9:30 p.m. So thanks for being part of this, and everybody for coming to join us today. So I'm Amy Halliday. I'm one of the co-curators of Infinitude, and I wanted to open our program by providing background and context to the exhibition, especially for those of you who haven't seen it, as a kind of framework within which to engage with the artist projects within it. And the artists themselves will be introducing their projects a little bit later. But as a background to the exhibition, I wanted to share that it is really one manifestation of an ongoing collaboration between Northeastern Law and Philosophy professor Patricia Williams, who you'll hear from shortly, and scholars and co-founders of the Visible Justice Research Hub at the University of the Arts London, Max Houghton and David Birkin. Now, this curricular, programmatic, and research collaboration is one that I was privileged to become part of about 18 months ago. And among the many lines of inquiry emerging from our conversations were questions about increasingly or intentionally ungovernable spaces, spaces constructed as new frontiers in relation to existing legal and social structures. For example, the realm of AI and cyberspace, the conceptualization of seasteading or charter cities, or the newly invigorated space race that looks to colonize Mars and mine asteroids. I don't know if anybody watched Don't Look Up, but that's obviously an interesting touch point as well. So one of the great joys of working with this interdisciplinary group that I've just mentioned is the way we all think with and through images, through art, through critical creative practice that generates insights, challenges assumptions, and holds the potential to catalyze change. And out of this collaboration was thus born the exhibition Infinitude, which, if you're not familiar with the term, takes its title from 19th century New England author Ralph Waldo Emerson, pretty fitting for Boston, of course. Now, Emerson had this influential notion of the infinitude of private man, which championed the limitless potential of the self-reliant individual, freed from societal constraints. And this infinitude perhaps reaches its problematic and exclusionary zenith in the figures of today's hyper-libertarian, super-rich techno-kings like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. So infinitude as a term also, beyond this usage by Emerson, also conjures up both the vast scale of the galaxy and the seeming industries of technology, private capital, military and corporate enterprise, and personal ambition driving what we've talked about as the contemporary space race. So Infinitude as an exhibition then pauses to look at how art is responding to these expanded frontiers. Some of the works in the exhibition critique the colonial imperative underpinning this new frontierism, while others offer alternative renderings of the future, of destinies that may yet manifest differently. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a brief spatial introduction to the exhibition by showing you a few installation views so that you can see the layout and pacing and the juxtaposition of the artist's works, which of course they'll share more about shortly. But I think it's really important to pay attention to those spatial relationships and give you a sense of the exhibition. Now, I'd encourage you to explore the exhibition in more detail in on your own time through our 3D model, which you can find on the website. It includes high-res images, label text, things like that. But it takes a little too much bandwidth for me. I'm currently tuning in from the East Coast of South Africa at home, but we'll pop a link in the chat. So firstly, if we swap slides, you'll notice the very dark walls of the exhibition. A bit of a bold choice, but scary as a curator. The very dark walls, but that color was a deliberate choice as a kind of grounding choice for conjuring something of the depth and reach and drama of outer space, but also as the ground from which Sophia Karim's meticulous architectural cosmologies, which are the first works you encounter in the exhibition, if you look at that kind of line or series of works in that image. And we thought that that color would really allow them to emerge as if they were floating astral bodies. Karim's Lita's house, if we can go to the next slide, visualizes space as a site for struggle and a way to imagine infinite freedom for those oppressed by authoritarian regimes in India and Bangladesh, for whom she also works through direct political action. So the show as a whole starts on a poetic and quietly disquieting note, and then it invites you afterwards to take a seat for work of a very different tone and approach. Go one back, yeah. So here in our next work after Karim's, you sit in a reclining leather gaming chair with a kind of bespoke Bluetooth headset. 1 second. Let me just go back to my notes. Yeah, you sit in the reclining leather gaming chair with a bespoke Bluetooth headset, conjuring up a sort of VIP individualized flight simulator as you watch Josh Begley's new video work, Amnesia Express. And we're really delighted to be the debut space for this work as well as Sophia's. Now, at first in this work, we see a 1990s Jeff Bezos waxing lyrical about the potential infinitude of the internet, and of course, I think his own nested within it, before taking off into space on his recent Blue Origin flight. And these archival media samplings are set alongside the ecological, socioeconomic, and political turmoil playing out across our earthbound terrain. So we've got this juxtaposition of two very different sets of work in the introduction to the exhibition. You then move into a space in which you're immersed in Monica Alcazar Duarte's 3-channel video installation, Ikamo Tlali, which is part of an ongoing project called Ascension, in which she works with film, installation, and augmented reality to examine how the potential terraforming of Mars is modeled in the tiny South Atlantic volcanic island known as Ascension Island. And you can also, while you're in that space, spend time with her award-winning photo book, The New Colonists, in which she juxtaposes a documentation of the sleepy town of Mars, Pennsylvania, which is a real town, with sequences of images chronicling the work of scientists who are researching how to colonize the planet. As you come to the final movement of the exhibition, Chitra Ganesh's lush and vibrant silk screens offer an alternate vision of the future, drawing on a visual language of science fiction, comics, nonlinear Indian mythology, and many other sources. In Prophecy, for example, instead of being built on a vision of expansion, resource extraction, and subjugation, aspects that kind of come up in the previous artist's works, we encounter a future envisioned by a powerful feminine figure in which the natural and built environments and technology appear mutually constitutive and fluid. Following Ganesh's prints, we then move into a space in which Larry Achampong's video work invests that future with the necessity and simultaneity of attendance to a colonial past. So later in the program, he'll tell us more about Relic 3, which is one of the films in the multimedia project Relic Traveler, in which the African Union takes the lead in shaping Earth's future. Crucially, their vision for responsible governance, and it comes back again to this question of ungovernable spaces, but their vision for responsible governance is shaped by the findings of the Relic Travelers Alliance, a team sent to space to recover the testimonies of the historically oppressed. The last shift in the exhibition is a kind of curatorial celestial cluster of a selection of Katie Patterson's ideas. And unfortunately, Katie couldn't be with us tonight, but we're so delighted to have her work and of course to have 5 of our 6 artists represented in this program. But Katie Patterson's ideas are really kind of word images and thought experiments. They're rendered in waterjet cut sterling silver, and they give shimmering form to thought experiments across time and space, asking the viewer to conjure in their minds what form these provocations might take. And the next slide gives you a sense of what some of these look like. This was, of course, a staged photograph with some of our gallery assistants after we'd installed these pieces, because as the person responsible for the on-ground shipping, installation, and other practical concerns of the show, I will say that these were a particularly interesting challenge, as these tiny shimmering works, which I guess you can see from the scale of hands there, were almost entirely installed with a minimal number of dressmakers' pins. And finally, set among Patterson's ideas is another work by Alcazar Duarte, which is a small levitating sculpture, and that is no small feat to fabricate, I'll tell you, called There Is No Planet B. We fabricated this in our university makerspace to the artist's specifications, but sourcing hundreds of grams of already dead bees required working closely with the head beekeeper of Massachusetts. So shout out to Kim if you're in our audience tonight. Awaiting my arrival in Boston from the UK, where I'm now based, in October, the bees were frozen. So we actually had to turn the gallery into an APND thawing zone before we could proceed with the rest of the show, just to give you a sense of some of the dynamics behind curating contemporary art. But the sculpture is, of course, a levitating specter of the complexity and fragility of earthly ecosystems, invoked through bee colony collapse. And the work's title, There Is No Planet B, also challenges the popular imaginary by which Mars increasingly seems a viable near-future alternative for human thriving, and one which undermines the urgency of action on earthly climate change, which is one of the threads we also see running through several works in the show. So I hope this short introduction just gives you a brief spatial and conceptual scaffold for the works that the artist will now share with us in a little more detail, and discussions that will follow with curators. As I mentioned, you can take a look at the exhibition at your own pace, in person or on the 3D tour, though the latter option doesn't include the full video works, of course. So if there's any way you can get to Boston, we're so delighted it's been extended due to popular demand, so you still have a couple of months to see the show. But I'm now going to hand over to my co-curatorial colleagues, David Birkin and Patricia Williams, who will lead the discussion with artists Larry Achampong, Chitra Ganesh, and Josh Begley. And just a note that to save time, so that we can rather spend it hearing from our great artists, we're not going to give extensive biographies, but rather we're going to put the artists and curators' website links right into the chat and just get into the discussion. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amy. Pat, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Yes.
I can hear you. I can hear you too. So Pat and I met yesterday virtually to try and what was supposed to be a fairly straightforward meeting to formulate some questions, and actually turned into a really expansive and wonderful conversation around the ways that the different artists' work intersect, particularly Chitra, Larry, and Josh. And we were thinking about what might be a good way to, a good entry point for this conversation. And we both agreed that it might be something to do with escapist narratives. So I was going to, Pat, I was thinking about the quote that we had, that we were discussing in relation to the symposium, the quote from Ronald Reagan back in 1986, where he in turn is quoting the former aviator and poet John Gillespie Magee. And I thought that might be a good jumping off point. So for those of you who remember, the Space Shuttle Challenger crashed in 1986, and the entire nation, the entire world was watching, from school children, I was a school child at the time, to people who remembered the first moon landing. And Reagan canceled the State of the Union address and gave the speech to the nation instead. And you also have to remember the time in which it occurred. This is kind of at the height of neoliberalism. This is at the height of the Cold War and of neoliberalism and all of those kind of political and that sort of political and economic confluence. And he ends his speech in which he uses it as a really good excuse to sort of berate Soviet secrecy. You know, we don't hide our space race. And to talk about the virtues of pioneerism, frontierism, and settler colonialism. He says these astronauts who lost their lives today, they were pioneers, you know, they were, and really kind of links it to that 19th century frontierist ideology. But he ends his speech with, you know, this quote. He says, "We'll never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and, quote, slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." And that last line is Reagan quoting the poet John Gillespie Magee. So I've only written down one question, and then I'm going to hand over to you, Pat, because you've probably written down, you're much more organized than me, and you've probably written down many more questions. But my question came out of our conversation, and it's this. One of the things that we notice links all of your works is a preoccupation with escapist narratives, whether it be escaping the Earth's gravitational pull and the political and economic violences of terrestrial life, or escaping the ideological limits and confines of the imaginary. Each of you conjure the utopian promises and the dystopian threats bound up in these futurities. Could you speak a little bit about how your work opens up possibility through narratives of escape? And really, I think that applies to all three of you. So I'd be very happy with whoever wants to chime in first.
And I actually specifically wonder if maybe Josh can start with that question about the frontierism, because his film includes an image of Jeff Bezos, not only defying the surly bonds of earth, but riding his horse. He takes the old-fashioned Western manifest destiny image of cowboy colonialism and puts it next to these images. They're all wearing cowboy hats.
Thank you so much, Pat and David and everyone. It's such a joy to be with you, thinking about some of this together, and it makes me really want to see the show in person. I think that, I think I've spent a fair amount of this pandemic thinking specifically about Jeff Bezos and that clip of his where he's in 1997 talking about how Amazon emerges as this thing that he is interested in because of the business plan that he wrote when he was working at a quantitative hedge fund in New York. And I think about this phrase that Teju Cole has been saying for the last year or two, this phrase market totalitarianism, and thinking about what it means to live in a moment of market totalitarianism where even the narrative of the market is the kind of dominating, all annihilating story. And I think about that in the midst of the last 2 years of living here in this apartment, and 4 blocks from here is where they started pulling up the refrigeration trucks at the beginning of the pandemic. And 2 blocks from there is the Metropolitan Detention Center, this sort of carceral demarcated space. And then right next to the MDC is this little corridor that goes to the largest Amazon processing facility in New York. And the constellation of those geographies to me was sort of a jumping off point for this work, which feels somewhat like a half thought and a mode of thinking about multiple images at once that is very much in the sort of influenced by and shaped by the work of Arthur Jafa and of Khalil Joseph, and trying to think about, fugitivity. When Nathaniel Mackey talks about fugitivity as the slide away from the proposed, or a slide away from the proposed. And thinking with Pat, I think over the last couple of years as well, has allowed me to think about market totalitarianism and the kind of river of images that that we can imagine alongside this kind of attempt to break the gravitational pull of this man Jeff Bezos, and think about what's happening on Earth in the month when these sort of space ventures are beginning. So that's kind of one of the ways that I was thinking about this notion of escape and of fugitivity alongside making this work.
And I wonder if we could maybe bring Chitra in at this point, because a lot of your work, Chitra, is about mythology, and it makes me, there are parts of your work in which I was thinking about Edouard Glissant's observations about having a right to opacity, which he places in tension with the sort of glaring insistence of the visual, of having to be seen all of the time. And he styles the right to opacity as a kind of shelter, a right to look back, as Nicholas Mirzoff might say. And you take very traditional origin myths and rewrite them in ways that creates a kind of boundlessness of the way in which origin myths might otherwise provide a kind of closed world, if that's fair.
Thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm really excited for the show. I really want to come to Boston now. And I love everyone's work and I love how it's installed. Thanks so much for that question, Patricia. I think that some years ago, like maybe, some 10 or 15, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, I began to think about how science fiction is our contemporary mythic narrative structure, because it asks all these questions about being, about difference, about what constitutes a human. It proposes alternate structures of governance and of relating to one another. And so thinking about that also led me to explore a little bit through my work, but also research the ways in which the visual language of early science fiction was very much connected to otherness and difference, to colonial narratives, and also is very powerful in shaping ideas of the future or futurity, especially for people of our generation who maybe grew up with some of this imagery of science fiction posters and pulp novels. So my work is also thinking about that. I really appreciated what you said, Josh, about like a proposition to the side, or is that what you said? Something like that. So I think of my work also as a proposition. And in addition to having, in addition to providing like an escape hatch, I think part of that also comes from thinking about how certain kinds of music or comics provide that escape hatch for young, non-normative people, and provide a different way to think while incorporating and centering pleasure in that, whether that's like acoustic or visual pleasure. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in my work. I also think that there's, it's interesting to think about how the narratives in science fiction have changed as well, like the earlier part of those being really grounded in like a fear of the other, or people coming to attack us, and then slowly evolving into sort of colonizing outer space. So I think that shift is also really interesting. And speaking of escape, I also think it's really interesting how many people have signed up for the Mars project, knowing full well that they will never be able to return. So that's like another layer of escape that reflects these harsh stratifications and realities that are in Josh's work, for example. So, and Larry's work as well.
Larry, you're muted.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I thought something was going to be asked towards me to expand on the question. But oh gosh, there's so much to unpack. I guess I'll try and keep things small for Relic, the Relic Traveler project. Relic Traveler 3, of course, forms part of a larger ongoing project, which is called Relic Traveler, which brings in ideas relating to migration, centers itself within speculation of the future with regards to the now, the experiences that we're having in this point in time. I guess one of the things that was really important to me with this project, but also with other works that I create that have a connection with science fiction, is really kind of grounding it within reality. I like to dream ideas, but try to connect them with actual realities. So, for example, the MiG suit, which the Relic Travelers are wearing, they're originally of Russian design, which were then later reverse engineered and developed by the Chinese. So that was an actual consideration for me in terms of thinking about the Chinese presence within that of the African continent, and how the Relic Travelers Alliance managed to create or develop a technology in order to fly through space and to land in places outside of the AU or the African Union. What's really important to me actually with the work actually is that it's not kind of imagining a utopia, but actually creating a set of questions within that of rejigging questions around dystopias. I think what was really interesting about what Chitra just said a moment ago about the end of the world, and I would additionally add things like apocalypse and so on, is within popular culture, for far too long the context has always been focused within the West. If the world is ending, it's simply the West. The rest of the world just doesn't seem to matter. There are no other perspectives. The West dies, so the world is dying. And so, what Relic Traveler really is doing is talking about what happens in place outside of that. So for me, the starting point actually was thinking about Brexit. I'd have a lot of conversations with friends before the Brexit vote in the UK about how that was going to go, and as a person who's grown up in the UK, I spent most of my time living in London, which is, for those of you who've not traveled there, an incredible kind of like melting pot culturally, socially, and so on. But if you just simply stayed there and didn't travel out to the rest of the UK, you would imagine that the rest of it is very much like that, which it isn't. So having had some experience of living in a place like Essex, I was able to understand like some of the deeper rooted kind of issues and problems regarding class and racism and what have you. And I remember coming back to these conversations around Brexit, just thinking that actually this question that's been asked by the public is going to go in one direction, which it did. And it wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't something of like, oh, kind of like gloating over like being right. Nothing about that at all, but really thinking about the, I think the hypocrisy really of the system that we have here, which I think, you know, relates to other systems in the West, which likes to talk about history from a very particular point of view. You know, I remember when I was in school, the way that the slave trade would be spoken about, for example, is very much that there were actual positives spoken about within textbooks and things like that. You know, how the dealing of human life can be can bring any positives. I don't quite understand, but when you have history that is dictated by those with privilege or power from only, you know, their point of view or perspective, then, you know, it's something that begs and needs to be challenged. So the way that I approached that with the Relic Traveler films, because of course there are a range of approaches with the project, utilizing sound, utilizing objects, the flags, for example, is by following through the films, of which there are 5 that exist so far, visually following the travelers on their journeys to uncover these pieces of information or vocal testimonies that may have been left at any particular kind of point in time, whilst audibly you are hearing some of those testimonies that are taking place. But really, I guess what I'm interested in with this, but I guess with many other video works that I make, is how the viewer kind of brings or kind of enters the conversation to bring in their own imagination around some of the questions that I am asking about realities and unshaped futures that are yet to take place.
And I apologize. I froze for a moment, but I should have brought you a question. But I'm really struck in your work, Larry, by the degree to which it is such a honeycombed landscape. It's both beautiful and open on the one hand, as this picture on screen shows, but there's so many signals, like the flags, of a kind of bordered existence for certain bodies, and it's such a poignant contrast to the way in which much of the space, the exploration of space, is being discussed as limitless, unbounded, and ungoverned.
Can you hear me? Wait. Okay. I'm so happy to see these works and discuss them. And I'm also thinking about the environment and the kind of intervention that this work makes, because I'm thinking about how narratives of science fiction and futurity coincide with this kind of, or actually rely on this kind of othering. I'm thinking about the way Hong Kong is like the nameless backdrop for Blade Runner, as is Tunisia for Star Wars. And so I think that the sort of the specificity with which the background is in relation to the character is also part of giving a new sort of subjectivity to this, or incorporating this another subjectivity where those figures that would be typically othered are the kind of point of subject, the subject position. So.
Yeah, no, I certainly relate with that, Chitra, you know, with my work. And I remember one of the earlier ideas of the first few films was to really have a focus on Western environments, but actually to make them be exotic, you know. And I remember having conversations with other friends, some people who are practitioners, others who are not, but really just talking about, you know, Black culture and representation within cinema, within science fiction, and you know, how many, you know, faces of color or Black faces have you seen within like a space kind of costume? How many can you count? You know, and so it's really this kind of driving intent to create something that for us didn't exist so much. Of course, obviously in, recent years, you have, things like Black Panther or, like Watchmen and whatnot, like incredible, popular culture shows and whatnot. But again, it's still, it's merely touching the tip of the iceberg. And so when I was, beginning to develop the work, I was imagining how many different ways can these kinds of messages be put out, whether that's through moving image or then through symbolism in terms of the Pan-African flags, and really looking into cultural histories, in this case thinking about the histories of Pan-Africanism, and their place not just historically but also contemporarily speaking, the importance and the need for something in the form of a beacon, and thinking about the flag or a flag as an object of which to try to explore a way in which those that are othered don't feel that way. My personal relationship with flags in the UK, for example, the Union Jack or the St. George's, have nothing but violence mostly attached to them. So even in my initial stages of developing the flag, it was quite a challenge, because I wasn't sure it would even be possible to create something where an individual may in and see across a skyline somewhere a flag that was genuinely speaking to them, because I didn't have that as a kid. I didn't have that growing up mostly in the UK. So yeah, that was really interesting that you said that, Chitra.
Yeah. No, similarly for me, the kind of that graphic visual language that you see in the comics that are part of Architects of the Future, it's something that I associate with sort of a comic language that was developed, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, actually around the World War, where Tarzan stories and G.I. Joe stories and Savage stories were all kind of melded into this kind of, fantastical mire. And so just this idea also with Josh's too, just taking these existing visual languages and re-sculpting them to reveal something that's actually already there, but maybe shine a light on it.
I love what you both just said, specifically about this attention to kind of early representations in science fiction. Has me thinking about John Aconfer's The Last Angel of History, and some of the ways that he very early on was imagining the world and imagining notions of data and representation and music, and in particular attention to sound. One of the channels in the Amnesia Express work, like the back channel, is basically pulled from the film Koyani Scazzi, and there are parts of Larry, I was listening to your NTS mix yesterday, the video game mixtape. Nice. One of the episodes, I suppose, and there were like 3 or 4 minutes into it, I actually had a moment where I was like, wow, this sounds to me, some of the scales that you were moving along sounded to me like the soundtrack for Koyani Scazzi, that it felt actually very, very much like the picture I was seeing in my mind was, in some ways, what's on the screen right now, kind of these expanse images. And it just, I think that it makes me think more about the extent to which sound is one of the engines that produces image for me. And I think that that's a lot of what happens when I experience some of your work too, Chitra, is that you give us portals through which to see new things and imagine differently. And I can't wait to see the show in person.
Bad, because I'm probably the only one who won't be able to make it, unfortunately, because where I am. But certainly relating with yourselves in terms of I think kind of like digging our hands into popular culture, but just kind of like bending things and asking, nuanced questions that need to be asked is what really kind of like has excited me about this show. And it's been amazing to be a part of something whilst being a part in this way. I mean, it's weird because I think even if, if the pandemic hadn't happened, group shows that there are moment potential connections, or sometimes that just doesn't happen. People are invited to do a show, sometimes people make it or they can't, but it's just amazing just kind of like looking across the practices, how and especially within this case within ourselves, how popular culture links us in quite a special way by kind of like traveling through time and literally, whether looking at things from a graphic perspective or, an oral or audio based perspective, how they all kind of, they become part of a similar kind of a universe.
Very much so.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, when David and I went to see the exhibit in person, one of the things that I noticed was David asked that the sound be turned up on that. So for those of you who do go in person, lean in to Larry's exhibit, because there's an overvoice as well that I didn't actually hear the first time around. And when you turned it up, listening to the substance of it, underscored the degree to which I think that learning to read both the visual and the oral at the same time and hearing them speak to one another is a skill that, I think is shifting culturally in a culture that's becoming more and more visual, and the visual sometimes overrides the substance of what's being said. I found that moment when the sound got turned up in a way that it really emphasized that the degree to which there are multiple languages being spoken at the same time, and sometimes they override each other in their symphonic nature.
I'm really glad that you picked up on that, Patricia, because as somebody who works a lot with sound when it comes to the cinematic space or moving image, and even as just somebody who's a cinema goer, and I love to go to the cinema. I just love the intimacy of being within the dark space and sharing a moment, or having differences of thought in relation to what's being seen, but especially heard and felt even, right? The reverberations of bass and so on, and how they travel. I've kind of more and more as I've gone along with my practice, I've felt more that, sound makes up at least half of the experience, I think, of the work, because you're dealing with multiple senses, right? Whereas the visual, as far as I'm concerned, you're dealing mostly with one sense, whereas with sound, it's something you're feeling as well as, what you're hearing. And it creates an entry into a range of kind of like multiplicities of even the way that we use language, the way that people call upon things. Whereas, an image, you can really, of course one can physically gesture, but to be able to do that like orally, I feel like it kind of, it has much more of a distance to that. So, storytelling, and probably through I guess my kind of like a kind of heritage and being told like folklore stories, I like to weave in layers or parallels toward, what is being seen visually. Just because you're seeing something visual, don't assume that what you're hearing is the exact same thing as what it is that you're seeing, right? So. And yeah, that's where I think, obviously with Jocelyn and Chitra, that's kind of taking place as well, verbally speaking, and then also on a pop culture level of like melding together, these different, references, whether it's the likes of Bezos kind of like talking about the early days of Amazon through to Gil Scott-Heron's Whitey and the Moon, and then I just love the poetry within Chitra's, you know, kind of like comic series as well. Like I can imagine the words even just existing, you know, on their own, you know, of sorts, as well as within this context of these stories that kind of have these continual layers.
And David, I think you were about to say something. I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you didn't at all. No, I was thinking a lot about, well, actually, Larry, hearing you talk about the kind of inverting that process of exoticization, I was thinking of Horace Obe's film, The Black Safari, the 1972 film. And I was thinking also about, you know, you mentioned that Brexit had been a starting point, and this very kind of troubled and difficult relationship with flags and national identity, you know, symbols of national identity. And here you are being commissioned to make a flag. And of course, so much of your work touches on a particular, you know, a particular moment, a certain promise maybe of Pan-Africanism and Garveyism that then sort of finds itself manifested years later through this expansion of the African Union, just at the moment when the European Union is contracting. And Patricia and I were talking yesterday about the four freedoms, you know, the four freedoms that effectively kept Britain from negotiating a deal, which is that if you want free movement of capital and free movement of goods, you also have to have free movement of people. And they weren't willing, the right-wing government wasn't willing to sign up to that. And it kind of, it made me think back to conversations we'd have around a sort of a symposium idea, which is about how, you know, on the one hand, we've got the sort of decoupling of capital from the nation state. We've got this moment when the taxless super rich are able to free float across borders, across jurisdictions, without, whether they're tax jurisdictions or legal jurisdictions, without being touched, on their Learjets, on their super yachts, you know. And in fact, you can buy citizenship to you know, half a dozen countries. And at the same time, there's this kind of restriction of borders, you know, that's tied to a kind of ethno-nationalist ideology and Trumpism and Brexitism and all of that. So we were really sort of thinking out loud about this, how simultaneously these two things are happening. On the one hand, the billionaires are floating off into space and taking their capital across borders with ease, and at the same time there's the kind of the bureaucratic tyranny of statelessness and people being refused passage across borders. And I wondered if you or all of you maybe might talk a little bit about this kind of contradiction, which I have a feeling is actually not a contradiction at all, but very revealing. Silence.
I don't mind kicking it off. Sorry, I just because I've been speaking a bit earlier on. Yeah, without kind of like making like the focus of the conversation that of COVID, although it is very much part of our lives. I mean, you know, an interesting example is thinking about Novak Djokovic with regards to traveling into, you know, Australia, and I'm not so much on social media these days, but I remember reading an article about it, and I think some kind of journalist or what have you mentioned was saying, you know, really interesting how, you know, someone within this kind of position who essentially is a millionaire is able to, like, you know, be put up in a hotel and whatnot, and, you know, you have people who are literally dying trying to cross borders to try to, you know, to live in places, let alone the fact that, you know, this person who is within this position wasn't able to actually tell the truth in what they were doing. You know, there are literally people who are using every sinew in their bodies simply just to try to live or to create a future for their families, for them to live as well. So, you know, I think, you know, that, yeah, certainly in terms of like bringing some of that point back to, you know, Relic Traveler, or even thinking about actually the inception of the ideas. Like I said, a lot of the now, as we know it, really inspired the thoughts around the development of the ideas. thinking about the African Union's passport program, which they've been developing for years, which will allow Africans to travel, amongst the other 54 states with no issue with regards to visa, that kind of thing. Really interesting how, such a large land mass within the planet is working on something that's quite revolutionary in a way, but it's not really spoken about. Yet the focus, news-wise, within the West is simply, this problem of migrants and whatnot. With such a hypocrisy around the development of said so-called great nations. Without migration, none of these nations are great or exist. Without migration, I'm not even here, let alone even my parents and so many other people who have contributed and continue to contribute and continue to be pushed to the periphery or even oblivion of any kind of recognition, right? So it's interesting how even in this point in time with the pandemic, how that has become a conversation. I'm sure for some of you, you may have seen, obviously, in terms of Brexit happening, that the issues regarding labour-based jobs and things like shipping jobs, truck driving jobs, which or the lack thereof people to be able to do those jobs, kind of owing to the crisis at the time of the delivering of like petrol and so on. So when then thinking a lot about these stupid questions, because I have to call them stupid questions about, do we stay in or do we leave the EU, in terms of people within the UK having conversation around that. I think like directors like Shane Meadows, who directed the film This Is England, which if you haven't seen before, I highly recommend, really on a very human level explains the ridiculousness of that. And that follows through with the series. I think This Is England, like 96, 98 or 86, 88 and so on. So it's really just trying to, whilst having, of course, the deep interest in migration through technology and things like that, centering it within a human conversation, because without that, it's just playing around with tech for the sake of it, and that doesn't excite me at all.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead.
I think we've gotten a signal to perhaps wrap it up. So if there are in time for the next session, so if we could ask for maybe just a.
I want to hear what Chitra had to say, though.
I do too.
Can we have a few minutes?
No, I just wanted to say that migration is the whole way everything came into existence. So the current views undergirding migration are just very settler colonialist. And I think that one of the interesting things that's happening in social movements around the world is that reckoning with there was a before, and that there was a before in other places outside the West as well. Like, for example, here, that reckoning is also around caste. So, and deforestation and land appropriation. So I think that, I just think it's like a very important question that you guys are linking to this kind of utopic sort of space exploration narratives that are abound.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to jump in there. That was so rich, and I know we could just keep going. But for those of you who heard something that sparked another thought, or even for the artists who are on that panel, just bear those things in mind. Please add them to the Q&A as we go along. So there's a Q&A function at the tab at the bottom of your Zoom program. And so do, as you think of something, pop it in the Q&A, as we'll have that open time a little bit later for you to ask your questions. So I'm going to kind of turn it over now. Myself and Max Houghton of London College of Communication will be in conversation now with Monica Elgazar-Duarte and Sophia Karim. And I thought what we could do is maybe start by asking them just to share a little bit about the work in the show before we jump into questions. So if that works for you, maybe Monica, we'll hand it over to you first, and then we have lots of questions.
Thank you for having us here. It's such a privilege to be part of this exhibition. I'm so honored and grateful. Just listening to everyone else talking about the work, it just makes me it is really moving, actually, to have all these connections with people that I've never met before and whose work is just amazing. The work the video installation that we ended up showing as part of Infinitude comes from a very deep sense of mourning nature in me. This has been happening for about 3 years now, when the ecological crisis around the world is becoming more and more an ecological disaster. And since 2014, I've been working on this project about the space exploration. And it started with the Mars One mission and having this conversation on a dinner table, and people saying people are going to Mars and never coming back. And I couldn't believe we were having this conversation, that I thought it would be a conversation of the far future. And so that prompted me to start making work about it. And it wasn't evident at first for me, but then it became evident that it was going to be something that had to take many years to produce. And so I decided to divide it in chapters, because I wanted to give myself time to react to how changes in technology and science would happen, but also to give myself time as a person to react to these changes and to change my position. I originally come from documentary, and so this was a very big shift for me of saying, if I put work out there, it might change, and I need to be able to put my hand up and say, I don't think like that anymore. So the first chapter is the book, and it includes, as you said, Amy, Mars, Pennsylvania, and it shows a little bit of scientists that I interviewed in the European Space Agency between 2016 and 2017, and them making all these habitats to simulate missions to Mars. And at that moment, it became very obvious to me that I wanted to communicate to the next generations, the younger generations. And so I figured out that augmented reality could be a neat way of make young people interested in these conversations. And so I included 5 different animations talking about the different layers of what I saw at that time was starting to happen as part of the new space race. And one of them being the lack of a legal framework to regulate corporations, which are the driving force today of the space race. And so then from there, I had an opportunity for another exhibition. I started working with Ascension, and I came across this experiment that Charles Darwin did many years ago when he passed through the island on during his trip in the Galapagos, and how he basically described Ascension Island as this charred little piece of land that had nothing. And then he proposed to have this experiment in which they changed the ecosystem and the island. So I think the experiment lasted about 12 years. And now Ascension Island contains 3 different ecosystems on itself. And of course, many different species have disappeared, local species and so on. And I found that interesting that there seemed to be a philosophy within the Western world in which knowledge could be something that you could impose, and it could be for the sake of gaining knowledge, you could do almost everything and you could push boundaries. And so that idea kind of resonated with other themes that I'm interested in. And so then from there, I produced the piece, the sculpture of the beast, because I'm interested in presenting ideas to people in an intriguing way, so they relate to these ideas. I know that we live in an era where speed is almost kind of injected into us, and we need to go faster and kind of include as many experiences as we can. And so I've seen audience members just scanning a room very quickly and getting out of the room and thinking that they know what they're looking already at, just from reading a little description of the exhibition and so on. So I always try to make things a little bit difficult for the audience, in the sense that they have to engage with the work if they want to get something out of it. And so the beats is part of that, of kind of forcing the audience to get closer to something and kind of really figure out what is on the petri dish and so on, and what's the narrative behind it. And finally, the third chapter, which is the film that I did for Infinitude, it starts with ideas of, after so many years of presenting the space race project that I've been working on, because I'm working on another project on algorithms and bias, I realized that people were really surprised of having someone who looks and speaks like me talking about the space race and space exploration and showing the augmented reality app in a very neat way, and you know, with no trying to be kind of complimentary. They would say, "Oh, I can't believe you did this. This is wonderful. I thought this was a man's work. Did you do the augmented reality app?" and so on. And so little by little, throughout the years of showing the work, these kind of started piling up in me, and it almost forced me to start putting myself within the work, but also to start embracing my indigenous roots coming from Mexico, and kind of questioning where this gaze of Western knowledge that today seems to be so global and so present everywhere, as if it belongs to all of us. How does it play when you kind of put it almost on the same level of importance to knowledge that has been declared as knowledge of the past? When you know, we will keep on talking about this on the discussion, I'm sure, but I think for me, the very influential work is by this Mexican researcher in Amsterdam, which is called Vistas of Modernity. And he basically questions this whole notion of the past and the future, and what it means to have cultures of the past and cultures of the future. And within my research, very quickly, I discovered that a lot of knowledge coming from Mexico, coming from New Zealand, coming from all these different indigenous cultures, prevailed in Western knowledge, and it was used as a basis to develop contemporary Western knowledge. And so I've made it my mission, and this is the first attempt to start kind of including myself in the conversation, but also kind of opening these questions, because I think that in the pickle that we are today with this ecological crisis, we need different points of views, and the people who are affected by this crisis mainly are not from the West, and they don't have a seat on the table, and they don't have a voice in this conversation. Not really. So that's more or less in a nutshell what the work is.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Sophia, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work in the show?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. It's really great to have this work in the show, and it's great to have met some of you guys. And I've come to know Monica and Amy and Max I already knew, and David, but I wish I could have met the other artists as well, and hopefully we still can, and there'll be more. I think I'll keep this bit quite short, because I'll go into more detail when you ask me the actual questions about the work. But this work is a project called Lita's House. I'm an architect, an artist, and an activist. And my activism focuses on human rights across Bangladesh and India, including campaigns for political prisoners. And Lita's House is a project which what's exhibited is a series of, I think, 11 drawings, and then the last one is a poem by the jailed poet Varavara Rao. And they're drawings of Lita's house, which is a house, it's an imaginary house for the disappeared and imprisoned. It's a mirror world of fascism and authoritarianism, and it's based on the cases of journalists, artists, poets, activists who are jailed and whose cases I'm close to. I think previously in the discussion, there's been talk on kind of the big global phenomenon of the sort of vast tyranny of fascism, ethno-nationalism. And I suppose what my work does is zoom down and down and down into how those very vast phenomena affect individuals on a very private and in some ways subconscious level. But I'll talk more about things as we go on.
Thanks so much, both. It's wonderful to hear you speak a little about your work and share it to the people who, like me, haven't been lucky enough to make it to Boston. Obviously, I've seen both of your works in real life, and thank you for that. I just wanted to say briefly a little bit about how the works came to be in the show, perhaps especially starting with Sophia's work, because it's certainly, as is already clear, not about the space race. I'm not saying that the other work is, but Sophia's perhaps least of all. But what I saw in it was this yearning towards something else that I would call freedom, and that is the language being used by the this kind of new frontierism, this kind of hyper-libertarianism that freedom equals being able to colonize a new planet. And I've been, David and I had both been in conversation with Sophia for a long time, and just understanding the way in which she might conceptualize a whole new world, perhaps this mirror world that you just mentioned, Sophia, completely differently in the first place, and also the quietness of her work, and the language that she's created seemed like a very necessary kind of counterpoint to these techno kings and their phallic symbols. So I'm grateful to you, Sophia, for kind of understanding, and well, obviously you would understand, but accepting that conceptualization of the work too. And with Monica, it's lovely to hear you speak about your work in the way that you did, and its initial documentary impulse, because I guess I first met Monica 10 years ago, and I was lucky enough to cross over as a tutor with the very end of Monica's master's degree as a student, and I can certainly see the connections and the feminism and the care that perpetuate still. And yes, although your work was more in some senses obviously about colonizing Mars, it's also about many more many other aspects of it. And I think that the climate colonialism aspect of it, the climate colonialism, but in particular colonialism, yes, obviously, but bringing the climate into it in the way that you have, the climate emergency, I should say. I think is another layer in the show that's important, and obviously connects with some of the other works too. So thank you for that. To give you both a sort of first question to think about, really in relation to what I just said. I wondered how the parameters of the exhibition, this idea of infinitude that we put to you as curators, how did that perhaps shift any thoughts you had towards your work in terms of its framing of either space or the space race or the new frontierism itself?
Shall I go?
Thanks, Monica.
Oh, okay, I go first. Sorry, I got confused there. I think it was an initial conversation when you guys, and when we were talking about the work that was going to be shown in the exhibition and what we were interested showing. I was right in the middle of shooting some of these scenes in Britain. Originally, I wanted to go to Ascension Island, but just before the pandemic, everything got canceled. So I had to be a little bit more creative towards that. And I discovered that the Jurassic Coast here in Britain somehow called me. And it became the backdrop of what is supposedly Ascension Island, or stands for the island, as I call it in the film. I think a lot of what we talked on that meeting definitely sat in the back of my mind, and definitely shaped more of the material that I showed, having to do with nature, having to do with our disconnection to nature, having to do with this sense of almost substance being replaced by resemblance. We didn't talk directly about that, but it was just floating in the air of our conversation. And this feeling of we are living in an era of disengagement. And So Infinitude definitely played in my mind when I was shooting a lot of this material. And a sense of a scale played a lot when I was shooting a lot of this material. A sense from the book, The New Colonists, I've been asking myself this question of, I mean, I'm not anti-tech and I'm not anti-science. I keep on repeating this, and I'm not, because people kind of get confused when I attack very much the philosophy that is going on in terms of knowledge and science and progress and so on today. But from the very beginning, I kept on asking the question, why would we want to go to Mars if we have Mars on Earth? And not, just to make a play of words in terms of saying what we have here is so wonderful and is so unique and is so fragile. How exactly is going to colonize another planet kind of, how are we not going to make the same mistake somewhere else? But also, how is that we are allowing ourselves to distance ourselves already? That, I think, for me, that sense of absence, this space in between what we have now, what we are already kind of thinking that we lost, and are already thinking of we're going somewhere else, it played a lot in my mind, and that had to do a lot with the talks of Infinitude in that conversation. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. And just also to add a sort of special thanks for making a brand new work, especially for the ideas of the show, and to extend that thanks to Josh clearly as well. Thanks, Monica. More on that in a second. And Sophia, thank you for printing this exquisite work for the first time, I think, for Infinitude. But yeah, the same question to you. How did our framing kind of affect your thoughts about it?
It was actually very interesting for me to have Litha's house included in an exhibition about space and that explores what you guys and the artists have explored. And I think it made me consider the connection more deeply of space and my work. I asked myself, why does Litha's house, my work, this house, look like space? Houses don't normally look like that, and houses I've designed don't look like that before. And yet this house I designed for the disappeared and imprisoned, this mirror world of fascism and authoritarianism, does look like that. So I questioned myself, why did I express architectural or domestic space as cosmological or astronomical space in this instance? And I think part of it is conscious. It's because in my work, and part of my work is trying to re-examine laws of architecture and so-called truths in architecture. So truths about beauty, which are rooted in geometry and proportion. And those sort of truths and ideals of beauty, particularly in Western architecture and Western classicism, are rooted in geometry, which itself is founded in astronomy. But this project is more than that. It's really about a feeling. I do see parallels between the existence of political prisoners and space, in the sense that for me, I think space is a very, very strong metaphor for that existence. So the immeasurable vastness of the predicament that the prisoner finds themselves in, it's a crushing and all-consuming thing. Your life as you knew it is just gone. You're cast adrift, and God help you on this lonely voyage. Also the conditions of their confinement, particularly in isolation cells like Anda, where Professor Anand Deltunde in India was sent this week. It makes me think of his loneliness. And then again, these images come back to my mind: the silence of the vacuum, the hinterland, and the terrible void. And so also there's this kind of, I think for me, there's a strange paradoxical quality to space. In some ways it feels abstract and uncaring, like the banal cruelty of fascism. And like I think of that scene in Kubrick's 2001, where Hal kills Frank Poole and he just floats off so quietly into space. But then on the other side, there's this kind of feeling for me of an immense benevolence and beauty in space. And I express that in my drawings as black, so black it could hold you. And lastly, the poems that the prisoners have written in jail, who on which these drawings are based, make reference to space and the cosmos again and again and again. So things about massive time, and some of the words appear in the drawings, as we'll talk about. And that's very significant for me. Yeah.
Can I say something? This is really interesting because in a way, with the film I made, is called Earthless, almost like a play on words on colonialism and you losing your home basically to other culture and being colonized, but also as us on Earth one day becoming earthless, and how we have been held hostage to this economic model. So it's fascinating that you are talking about the space the way you're talking about, Sophia. And the connection also of this standardized language of architecture.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, they're homeless, and the things they're fighting for are some of the things that we've discussed in the earlier part of this conversation. So against caste oppression, against the corporates, against ethno-nationalism, and they are the exact things that they're fighting against. And their incarceration has put them onto the other face of the earth, the face that we don't see anymore. And it's also about this kind of thing of scale, because space makes me very much think about scale. And so the idea that, as I said, the forces of fascism, of authoritarianism, of the market totalitarianism that Josh talked about previously, are of an immense scale. And then when they target one individual, as they have to these activists, they're dwarfed in scale in comparison, and they're having to fight something of an infinite proportion.
It's great that you bring so many moments of what you just said. Anticipated another question that we had, but I also just wanted to comment on something. One of the works that we weren't able to show of Curators from Architects of the Future has this beautiful line about the intimacy of the void, which really brought me back to what you said about black, so black it could hold you, and this push and pull between immensity of scale and uncaringness, and on the other hand, this seeming intimacy or the potential for being held. But it also brought me back to that tension between the overwhelming sense of being a kind of economic hostage, and yet the sense of the spiritual that really pervades your work. So one of the things that we were interested in thinking about is that your work is really informed by this knowledge that what fuels our neoliberal world is profit. But there's this very deep sense of a spiritual realm in each of your work that I think is also there at the same time. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that kind of spiritual dimension to each of your works.
You go, Sophia.
Okay. Well, I mean, for me, architecture has always been connected to spiritualism from its earliest and, well, what we call primitive forms, although I would argue that architecture under market totalitarianism is probably the most primitive form it's ever been. Architecture knows that it can connect us with something beyond ourselves. Now, in the neoliberal era and today, architecture has been reduced to financial speculation. It's a commodity. And so its spiritual potency is gone. Or worse, it's actually been co-opted into this kind of materialist form of spiritualism. So like every luxury apartment, every hotel, every office you go into is like Zen minimalist now. Now, when talking about spiritualism, I believe that the essence of architecture and the inner meaning of architecture has something to do with human suffering, life, and death. And I've argued also that buildings of the neoliberal era, which are most of what we see around us in the built environment, are afraid of death. I'd say they despise it. And I'm saying this from a position of working as a professional commercial architect for over 20 years, in big offices, small offices, and producing those buildings. I'm guilty. They're built in clean synthetic materials that don't die. They're buildings of extreme greed and of extreme cowardice. But if you look at architecture in its truest sense, and sometimes that doesn't have to be a structure where any architect has even been involved, there's a sort of profound melancholy of certain structures, which I think can't be ignored. And what is that? What's that about? I think about it all the time. And for me, it is connected with death and the spirit. And so recently, Max knows this, I visited the island of Iona in Scotland. And it's known as a thin place, where it's said that the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world is said to be thin, and you can easily pass through from one to the other. And I wrote to jail professor Anundel Dunde, who's in India, from there, from Iona. And I wrote to him about the thin place. And I sent him drawings I made from there. And what I wrote in the letter, and I think it relates a bit to these drawings, I'll just read, is I said, sometimes I wonder if drawings are thin places. Perhaps that's why I send you drawings, as a means to escape into the image and enter another world, a world on the other side of this planet, or a world even beyond this, where Father Stan resides. I don't know. That's it.
This is, it makes me think of so many things in terms of the way I'm thinking of nature and our relationship to nature as a concept, and how nature becomes this distant horizon that exists in harmony. It's almost like a picture perfect thing that we have in our mind. And I was reading, I think it's Zizek, who says, if we would see all the messiness and the chaos and the death, that is also part of nature. And we wouldn't romanticize it as much, and it would be present every single day of our lives, we would be more inclined to understand what's going on with nature today. But because it's this distant, as you're saying, like I'm thinking of these buildings and the way you're describing these buildings and this fear of death,
I think that's a really important point, Monica, because I see in architecture all the time now the amount of greenwash that goes on. I mean, I've seen enough greenwash to last me a lifetime. And it's this kind of idealized version of nature. And I think the whole sustainability movement in architecture, Western architecture, I have no time for it. It's based on these kind of idealized notions of nature, this false spiritualism. And yet they don't invite the communities, the sort of people that some of the activists who are Father Stan Swami, for instance, one of the activists who was jailed and died, who lived with tribal communities for 50 years. In jail, he wasn't eating enough, so his fellow activists were worried and said, you should eat more. And he said, living with the tribal communities, I saw what they ate and I halved my portion, and that's how he ate. And I never hear any environmental activists or architects talking about sustainability here, talking in language like that. I never hear any of them that have a real spiritual connection with the land.
For me, for this film, I came across a book written in Hawaiian, and they talk about the notion of contentment. And this is the slide, and I think it's connected to what you're talking, Sophia, because it's a different way of looking at things and life and living life and seeing and experiencing and holding knowledge and calling something else knowledge and embracing mysteries, without being romanticizing or anything. I don't like those notions of romanticizing neither nature nor indigenous culture and so on. And it hit me like when I came first across this concept of contentment or being content. I immediately thought of it's not about having enough. That was not the idea that came to my mind immediately. But as I kept reading the philosophy behind Hawaiian culture in particular, they were talking about just opening your eyes and looking at what we have and realizing that we have enough. Mm-hmm. That you don't need to keep on growing. You don't need to keep on expanding. That you don't need to keep on going anywhere else, that you have enough already and is here and is in front of you. And it really resonates with me what you're talking about in terms of the food and food sharing and looking at each other and saying, I have enough. I don't have to be super full in order to be content. I just have to look around me and be part of this community to be content and share. I watched 2 documentaries a couple of days ago, and they're all documentaries, and they're about this Silicon Valley philosophy of making good in the world while making money, right?
Yeah.
It's not bad to make good in the world and make money at the same time. And it really jarred with me because part of making good in the world is not having to have anything for yourself. It's about doing something for the sake of it that is good for others. Why would you want to make business out of it? Mm-hmm. And suddenly this philosophy is just going hand in hand with the technologies that we're seeing that are developing and with this hunger of going to other places and expanding forever and ever and ever and measuring our success as a society in terms of that, in terms of infinite growth and infinite progress. I think it's interesting relating it to architecture. All these buildings are sprawling around London. I'm in East London, and I'm thinking, how many more buildings? There are not enough. There's so many homeless people, number one, just beside the construction sites. And number two, how are we going to cope with the transport? It's a working class neighborhood. Of course, everyone who has to go to work because they need to go to work and cannot work from home are on these packed trains. These are the people who are going to suffer from these kind of developments. Even the word of it is just counteracting.
Yeah, it's these notions that you talk about in your work, Monica, of development and progress. And these are the words very much used by the fascist regimes, and specifically the regime of Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP. Everything is justified in terms of, but it's progress. And then the hypnotized population all buys into that. So there are lynchings on the street, incarcerations everywhere. It's hell on earth, but they're hypnotized by this concept of progress, and this is the right way to do things.
In terms of Mars, in talking about hypnotism, I learned that NASA admitted a few years ago that they had tinted these images of Mars that they took on the Land Rover, on the Mars rover, I don't know, whatever it's called. They tinted to make it look more like Earth. And it's part of this language of hypnotism, right? In which we end up imagining ourselves doing something that is not possible even, like we could never duplicate life on Earth somewhere else. But here we are creating this mythology in which that gap in between life on Earth and Mars is being kind of, reduced, but it's all a fantasy.
You're just reminding me of something that I brought up. So sorry, Max. If you've ever looked at Elon Musk's Twitter feed, but his landing image is a very reductive view of the 4 stages of terraforming Mars. And it just very easily moves from the red planet to a perfect vision of Earth. And again, what you were saying about this kind of creating this popular imaginary when we can never replicate what we have. But I'm seeing that so much in visual culture and all around me. I was walking around Bristol just after Christmas, and there were all these sales for box sets of make your own Mars colony. Construct your own with figures and rovers and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely everywhere, and part of this kind of architecture of making it seem so feasible, so imminent. But Max, I want to pass over to you. I jumped in there.
No, not at all. I was also going to make a brief comment just about short-termism that I learned actually from listening to a previous conversation between you guys, between Monica and Sophia, and about the kind of the building in London that I think this is architectural inside knowledge, or at least I didn't know it. But Sophia, you were saying that the kind of new high-rises, I'm sitting in Elephant and Castle, an area that's just recently gentrified, that the lifespan of such buildings is 80 to 100 years. So
yeah, so when in the specifications for some of the materials, the specification will say that the material needs to last 80 years, and the material will be something like anodized aluminium or something that has no embodied history. On the one hand, it will die in 80 years, but then during that 80 years, it won't show any kind of decomposition or death or change. It's really strange. It's this kind of artificiality. So yeah, it's to do with churning an economy. These buildings are created because they're like drugs or arms or fossil fuels. They're basically about churning an economy, and that's what building development is.
Yeah, we could definitely talk about that for a while longer. I'm just going to return to your work because we're slightly, I guess, short of time. But yeah, really important conversations. But I guess still in terms of other knowledge bases, perhaps in terms of interesting ways to talk about ancient hierarchies between image and text, but the ways in which you both bring words one way or another into your work is incredibly important. So Sophia, it was definitely news to me that we could find a Bangla typeface and use that.
Telugu. So Praveen, my friend Praveen, I don't know if he's here, he did that text for me in Telugu language. Yeah.
Beautiful. And obviously the inclusion of poetry, which we've got on screen right now, which is extraordinary. And Monica, just perhaps in terms of you speaking in, is it your grandmother's indigenous in tongue, in excuse my pronunciation, Noatal?
Yeah, in Nahuatl. I mean, it's becoming a whole journey for me. So it's not my grandma, it's my great grandma. They were the last generation part of a community in Mexico. Because my great grandma was the last, and because my great grandma was born with green eyes, they decided that they could leave the community, and that's so sad. And so to the point today that I'm the first generation kind of wanting to reclaim this part of an identity that is part of our family that has been erased, and it's been shown with. I don't know if it's not pride. I don't know what it is, Max. It's living in a post-colonial culture, I think. It's very difficult. It has many layers of trauma and pain, and it's very complicated. But for this project, it's the first time that I'm really embracing that and going into the journey of learning Nahuatl. So I use that translator because I'm not that good yet. But the title, I decided that it was important to include it in a different language that was not Spanish, and trying to kind of recover. I'm getting in touch with Mayan scientists, for example, and so on. So it's a whole journey for me, this third chapter. And at the center of it has to do with a different way of relating to nature and a different way of relating to knowledge and community.
Beautiful, thank you. And Sophia, yeah, just to talk perhaps a little bit more. So was it our 13th image in the show is purely words?
Yeah. That image is purely words because I wanted to end on that image, because my work is about people whose voice has been stifled or stolen. They've been jailed for their voice. And so I really had to end with their voice, not mine. And that's a poet by Vara Vara Rao, a poem by Vara Vara Rao, who's an 84-year-old poet, and he's one of the BK-16 prisoners in India, whose cases I'm very close to and follow. And he's currently on medical bail, I think, and hopefully they don't put him back, but they very well might do. But yeah, I mean, coming back to language, so on the wall beneath my drawings in this exhibition, there's a line of text actually written on the wall. I'll read that text out. So it says, in Lita's house stood a structure, and the structure was the gallows, built of universal beams. But the beams were not of recognizable units. They followed a different scale of measurement, mrittumetry, the geometry of death. So mrittumetry is one of a number of words that I've created because the words that already exist in architectural terminology don't always say what I want to say. And that word in particular is from mritu, which is the Bangla word for death, and metri as in measurement. So from the Greek, and Indo-European origins of metria and me for measuring. I had to create new scales for my drawings because if I had defined the scale as, conventional scales, say metric or imperial, one wouldn't necessarily know that I'm talking about death. But when I define the scale as mrittumetry, there's no escaping what that drawing is about. But there's also another reason, and I think it's also, the reason is that in Lita's house, measurement itself follows different laws. So mrittumetry, that scale that I invented, it derives from the imperial 10 inches, because 10 inches is the dimension that each prisoner is allocated in the Amdani cell, which is the holding cell in Keraniganj jail in Bangladesh. And I made many, many drawings of the bodies in that jail. One of them, the drawings in this exhibition, Great Bear, you'll see a kind of knotted clump of lines in the corner. And that was where I vectorized those bodies. So the bodies in the jail have to lie knotted together in scissor formation to pack them in at such high density. So it's men in that cell, and they have to lie opposite each other, groin to groin, knotting their legs together. And sometimes I was drawing those bodies as figurative bodies again and again and again. And sometimes I was drawing them as vectors abstracted in space. And Great Bear was a constellation that my uncle, Shohidul Alum, he was mapping constellations from his cell when he was jailed. One of them was Great Bear. So in that drawing in the exhibition, you see a knotted mass where I take the Great Bear constellation and I knot the vectors in scissor formation again and again and again. And those drawings are in this scale mrittumetry, which is based on the 10 inches. And I created many words like this, and it makes me think of what Monica was saying, because in a way, they're also a kind of bastardized Bangla. It's a mixture of Bangla and architectural terminology, but my Bangla is a kind of bastardized Bangla because, as an immigrant, I don't have the skills of the native speaker. As you said, Monica, it's the same for you. And so the words I use are that as well.
Yeah, I think just a little for ending this, it has been really difficult for me to understand how much of it is okay to actually go back and reclaim. I think it's about giving yourself permission to and kind of understanding within yourself why you're doing certain things. That is important, so it doesn't feel. I've been outside for so long. I think in this way we connect a lot, Sophia, that you grew up in the UK. I've been outside for so long that I sometimes feel a foreigner in my own country, and I'm seen as an outsider in many ways.
Yeah.
and to suddenly kind of go back and then say, now I'm interested in this because these are questions that are finding me while I'm outside, is a very contradictory position to be in, and a very hybrid kind of position to be in. But at the same time, being here is giving me this perspective of almost seeing the need of something that needs to happen in Mexico, that in many places that is not happening. And I'm just like hoping that in some small way, I'm a catalyst for something else, you know, for kind of a resurgence of pride of certain practices, and resurgence for everyone almost reclaiming, not everyone, but people who I'm close to, reclaiming certain ways of doing things and thinking.
Yeah, I think it gives people confidence to have a go. If you've done it, others may have a go.
Yeah, I think the idea of these practices of colonialism and neoliberalism making us literally strangers to ourselves, actually everyone on earth, but especially people from colonized nations, is an extraordinary way of thinking about it. And the idea of you questioning what's yours to take back. And extraordinary. Thank you. Amy, were you going to ask do we have time for another question? I hope we do.
I think it is possibly time to segue into the more open section, but I'm going to do that with a question that is kind of targeted towards both of you, and then we can see if the other artists maybe want to jump in on that too. So perhaps we can spotlight the other artists and bring them back into the conversation, because what this, my question kind of comes out of the teaching that we're doing in the gallery. So one of the great things about working as a curator and educator in an academic gallery space is that we work closely with faculty and students, and we're really able to kind of activate the exhibition and the artwork in and through these really interesting conversations across disciplines. So I wanted to share with you a little experience that Juliana and I had teaching with Monica, your work, and Josh's actually particularly, for a philosophy course that was taken mostly by computer science and engineering students on technology and human values. And this was something that came out of this. So I was teaching for this class, and I called out that moment that you just mentioned, that you also had the screenshot from, where you say there are languages in which the word progress means to be content. And the faculty member noted that if you read content as an adjective, then you, as this alternate idea of human advancement or flourishing, it has real liberatory potential. So being content rather than this endless accumulation that we've talked about. On the other hand, the current practice associated with this kind of Silicon Valley mindset that you also alluded to earlier is to define progress by reading content as a noun. So the state of literally being made into content. So progress is that state of being content. So I wondered if either of you, and potentially some of the other artists, maybe Josh, others who are also delving into these like media troves and online content, about this kind of tension with technology, these slippages of language and languages. If there's anything there that strikes you in the same way it struck these students who were kind of pushing and pulling, how you might read that sentence.
I mean, naming and words are the way that we shape the world. The naming the world shapes the world. And so it is really interesting. I have to think a little bit, but I think in this era in which we are completely focused on the self, and community, a sense of community, little by little, is being kind of pulled away from us. And we are kind of engaging more and more with ourselves and selling ourselves and selling our lives without even knowing it. It makes sense, what you're saying. And the contradiction of it, the really sad and tragic contradiction of it, of how a word can be forgotten, content as a contentment, can eventually be forgotten and be assignated almost an automatic way of thinking of it in a different way that means something else. I find it really tragic and shocking. Yes. I don't know what else. I need to think about it longer, but yes.
It was just interesting to see that come up, and the way the students were reading it, and almost the immediate kind of journey they went on. Yeah.
Shocking. Yes. It's almost like losing language in a way, losing meaning. I mean, this whole other project on algorithms, I'm like so into meaning and how meaning is being shaped by machines. We used to shape meaning for ourselves, by ourselves. And now meaning is being codified and shaped and curated for ourselves by machines. And I find this interesting, very, very fascinating. I'm going to have nightmares now. I'm in because of this. Yes.
I think we're just in the process of spotlighting a couple of other panelists. So just to ask our artists, if you can put your videos back on, we can then bring you back into the main conversation, but we can't do that unless you have your videos on. So that's curators and artists. If you can put your videos back on, then we can bring everybody back into the conversation. And just a reminder to the audience that you are welcome to share your questions either by using the raise hand function or the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. So I'll just let us quickly do that. Okay, sorry to leave you there, Monica. Just be a sec. Okay, I'm just getting everybody back. All right. Okay, sorry, we're just getting everybody back here. There we go, we've got Patricia back. Okay. There's David. All right, we're getting there with getting everybody back in the conversation here. And we've got somebody's unmuted as well. Okay, so did anybody else want to respond to that provocation about progress and being content or being content? And if you want to, just feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Okay. Well, if there were other questions within the group, I know we were kind of alluding to each other's works as we went along. So if there are any questions that any of you had for each other, perhaps now would be a good time to jump in and ask those.
I would actually love to know a little bit more from you guys, the curatorial side of things, like how your own work or research and the trajectory of that led to these focuses for the show. Because I know some of you have been working together for a bit now, so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how that landed here.
I wouldn't mind coming in on a tangent. It's not the beginning of it. Thanks for the question, Chitra. But I did remember while sort of everyone was talking that in terms of the title Infinitude and the fact that it comes from Emerson, it was actually Pat who, in one of her amazing Justice and Aesthetics lectures that David and Amy and I were all privileged enough to go to for a whole term, told me that Emerson had been kind of appropriated by these hyper-libertarian guys. And I was like, what? Because I'd only read Emerson in terms of nature. I mean, literally his work, nature, etc. And so I couldn't immediately get my head around it. And so I went back to like his work on self-reliance. And indeed, in some ways, with that head on, if I were a hyper-libertarian person, I suddenly understood how those possibilities could be read into the work. But what it made me think about, and perhaps in terms of the environmental content of some of the work that we've spoken about today, it made me want to kind of reclaim that notion of what nature might be. But as I say, that's slightly tangential.
I could start or say a little bit about how we all know each other, or how it came to be that this became such a warmly entangled conversation. I met Max, I think, some years ago. I was teaching a class on seeing and surveillance that was offered in Paris for a summer. It was a summer session through Kent University. And I think it was the first time I had talked about legal structures in a room full of people who were not lawyers, but some who were very, very focused on the question of visuality and vision. And Max was certainly one of the people who was whose ideas kept me up at night from then on. And so that was some years ago. I think at about the same time, I met Josh Begley, and through some of his work when he was an artist in residence, both for the Intercept and I think was it for the ACLU that you were? The New York Civil Liberties Union, and so again there was this translation. And a rising awareness, I think, of the degree to which I am a sort of a product of a reading generation, a child of the book. And I am increasingly struck by this shift in our entire world because of technology to the visual, works in a very different part of my brain. And the power of that in legislating my feelings and legislating outcomes made me focus upon the increasing significance of that effective region in what we even think of as legislation, and where its sources might not be the textual, might not be the documentary, might not be capable of being contained by the four corners of a document or the four corners of a courtroom. And so that was my concern. Josh and I then ended up teaching a class together some years ago. And the class was Law, Media, and Public Policy. And that, in turn, when I came to Northeastern, and became affiliated with the philosophy class, it really made me think about this as an aesthetic proposition, and my continuing conversations with Max, and then meeting David. Max and David were working together on a project called Visible Justice at the London College of Communication. Is that right? That's where it was sort of given birth? And our conversation, so let's do this together. And Amy, who is at that time was the resident curator of Gallery 366, where our exhibit is. This all came together, I think, last spring in terms of let's get a grant to have a series of lectures, conversations, and interdisciplinary synthesizing of this dilemma. And then, sort of obediently, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk just filled in what we were thinking about.
I would say I think to that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chicha.
No, go, please. No.
Oh, well, just to that on two fronts. One was just how incredibly timely some of this was. We were able to be incredibly responsive, which was exciting, and yet some of your work was produced before, and is just endlessly timely, as we see these reproductions of kind of colonial imperatives and things like that in these benches. But also just an appreciation of how many of you were willing to come along on the journey and make new work. it was often this perfect coincision of a kind of a new way of thinking, maybe a line of inquiry that you were following as well. And I just wanted to mention that as much as this was an entanglement of curators, it was also that birthed from relationships. And I think as a curator, a lot of my work comes from ongoing relationships with artists that kind of emerge, something will emerge over time. And it was wonderful for this to develop out of so many of those relationships, whether it was like Max and Monica and Sophia, or David and Chitra and Larry, or Josh and Pat. I think that relationality also, and that potential for trust and creative co-creation led to something really special. So I think that's also a really key part of how this came to be. Many of you jumping in with maybe not a lot of forewarning or the time you might usually expect to have for an exhibition, and using it as a way to kind of further something that you were interested in as well. So just thanks for being part of the journey. But Chitra?
No, I was just thinking with what Patricia was talking about in terms of like the visual gaining dominance. And I think one of the things about how that visual dominance happens is seeing multiple narratives at the same time, like whether you see it on the news screen with the scroll below, or you're looking at image and text together. And I think that's also something interesting that connects all of the works here, is the textuality and like having multiple parallel narratives and juxtapositions and the meaning coming from the in-between.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's, sorry, Pat, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one of the things that always comes to mind when that something like that point is made is the image of during the second campaign debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, was when he supposedly famously lurked behind her, and during that moment she was talking about canceling student debt. She was talking about healthcare. She was talking about an incredible range of substantive issues. But in watching, I couldn't hear a thing she was saying. I had to go back and re-listen to it because his visuals completely made the ears close down. And I think it did that for everybody who watched that incredibly bizarre moment. But you're right, the meaning one takes from it ultimately was the in-between that image and her speech, and it was something different altogether. What it produced was something, it shaped a very different kind of future, it spoke between.
And I do find all of your work so, sorry, David, just really briefly, but just I find everyone's work so multi-sensory, but it doesn't fill and kind of collapse my senses. It just allows me. I think Pat was saying something about the over voice on Larry's film, and it's just the sensuality in the work is really moving for me. Thanks, David.
Yeah, just to add that this was also sort of born out of a collaborative colloquium that we organized. When was it, Pat, Max? I've forgotten.
I feel like it was January
2020. Yes, January last year.
Which was all about kind of forms of algorithmic violence, basically. Which we all know about now. Ways in which race and gender are inscribed. And I think Pat had, correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, but Pat had been thinking about the implications of this for the law and for legal jurisdictions and for ways of what she refers to as black letter law. Which goes back to your thing of the visual versus the textual. So we actually put on a colloquium symposium, and then we were in the process of organizing another one when Amy popped in and said, do you guys want to do an exhibition? And somehow the ideas that we've been exploring for the symposium, which hasn't happened yet, hopefully will, kind of found themselves, they were sort of manifested through the show in many respects. We started thinking like, can we put together a group of artists who are in some way kind of either on the one hand critiquing this new, we called it the new frontierism, this new form of frontierism, either artists who are critiquing it or artists who are imagining otherwise, a possibility beyond that. And I remember my friend, the artist Nathaniel Mellors, saying, oh, David, you know, libertarianism is just anarchism for rich people. And so thinking about, you know, what does it mean? So we have this, you know, everyone keeps talking about Bezos and Musk, and we have this kind of 0.01%, the super wealthy, who are, you know, first they're jetting across borders in their Learjets, and then they're jetting into sort of interplanetary space on their rockets. And of course, everything is phallic. You know, Patricia, I mean, there were various GIF files going between all of us of, you know, different billionaires on different phallic-shaped rockets, and, you know, disappearing off into, yeah, and that's kind of in some of your work as well. Like, you know, how is the sexual imaginary kind of bound up with this sort of new political imaginary? And go ahead. I can see you. Pat, go ahead.
I was going to underscore. I mean, it was. You mentioned algorithms, and that was another. I think that it represents, you know, this quantitative language. There's visual, there's the verbal, but there's also the quantitative language that to which Sophia, you know, alluded in the pure geometry, the geometric beauty of architectural forms and their communication of a certain affect. Or its suppression of affect, as I think Monica described. You know, we lose meaning because there is this other language at work, which through perhaps algorithmic writing or machine writing sometimes, invisibly silences or directs or guides. But that was also part, I'd forgotten that the algorithmic was a very important part of the early conversations in this.
And there's been a genuinely kind of quite organic process. I know it always sounds slightly trite to say that things are organic, but it was really true. I mean, we first worked with Sophia on a much earlier symposium at LCC, just at the moment when her architectural practice was kind of galvanizing into her activist practice, because through necessity, because her uncle Shahidul had been incarcerated, and so that was happening, and she came and spoke at that symposium, and then it's been a real joy just kind of watching all of your practices develop in ways which, you know, I've known Larry. How long have we known each other on and off? Sort of, I think we found each other in some strange town in France about a decade and a half ago.
10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And Chitra, you know, who I've also known on and off over
many years. Yeah.
Yeah. And Josh, who your work I've known for a long time, but I hadn't met you until Pat introduced us. And Monica, it's just been a real joy to meet you. So the whole thing has genuinely felt like a sort of coming together, and I think it shows in terms of the, you know, hearing you talk. What was it, Amy? You quoted one of Sophia's works talking about. I don't want to misquote you.
Oh, black so black it can hold you. Black so black it can hold you.
And then the line from Chitra's work about the void, and, you know, and thinking through also what the various valences are for Larry's work, and like I think there are so many kind of moments of connection, and it's just I'm going to stop talking because I actually just enjoyed hearing the artists kind of ask each other questions.
Thank you.
I'm also very aware that we've come to the kind of formal end. I'm very happy to stay on the conversation, but I want to give our attendees a chance to slip off if they need to, but also thank everybody who's been here. And I hope that's been a special journey for you as it has for us. And I did want to say for Larry and others, we are very much hoping to travel the show potentially to the UK. We'd welcome any suggestions from our attendees or our artists of institutions that might be interested, galleries that you might think would be a good fit as we kind of start that process of thinking where that might go, but also how these conversations might develop with other projects or expansions of projects in a kind of new chapter of Infinitude. So don't want to kind of get ahead of myself, but I did want to put that out there in case anyone listening has any thoughts. Great. Well, with that in mind, I'm going to close the formal part of this chat, but if those of you who would like to stay on are welcome to continue to contribute. Thank you so much for everyone who's come, and we really encourage you to spend some time with the 3D model of the exhibition, but really hopefully in person in Boston or wherever it goes to next. And thank you all for being part of the conversation. All right, thanks. Have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your comments, those of you who have said thank yous and appreciated this time together. Thank you so much for being with us.